The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Schönbrunn Palace, its golden facade gleaming under the crisp European sky. Alexander Fischer, a seasoned royal guard, stood immaculately still, his red and navy uniform a striking contrast against the ancient stone. His posture was unwavering, every fiber of his being trained for discipline, for duty. Tourists bustled around, snapping photos, murmuring in hushed admiration, until a deep, guttural growl sliced through the chatter. "Easy there, Brutus," a voice drawled, thick with mock amusement. "You'll get your turn soon enough." Vincent Moreau, a stocky man in his 40s, pushed through the crowd, a taut leather leash clutched in his tattooed hand. His English bulldog, Brutus, strained against it, muscles rippling beneath his brown and white coat. There was something unsettling about Moreau, something in the deliberate way he let the leash slacken, then yanked it back, a game of controlled aggression. Before following the forums behind, let me know which country you're watching from. And please comment what kind of story do you have. A mother hurriedly pulled her son behind her. An elderly couple exchanged worried glances. The tourists instinctively stepped back, creating a small clearing around Moreau and his dog. "Look at him standing there," Moreau sneered, loud enough for the gathering crowd. "Dressed up like some kind of toy soldier. Thinks he's untouchable, huh?" His grin widened as he moved closer, allowing Brutus to inch toward Fischer's perfectly polished boots. "What do you think, boy? Think he'll still stand tall when you give him a proper greeting?" Fischer remained motionless, eyes locked forward, his training sharp as a blade. But beneath his stoic exterior, he had already sized up the real threat, not the dog, but the man holding the leash. And he knew, this wasn't just some tourist causing trouble. This was something far more deliberate. Seen at Schönbrunn Palace, the air was thick with tension as Vincent Moreau took another deliberate step forward, his grip tightening and loosening on the leash in calculated intervals. Brutus, the burly English bulldog, responded instinctively, his growls deepening, his weight shifting forward, muscles coiling in anticipation. The crowd edged farther back. Eric Lundgren, a seasoned tour guide, had seen his fair share of unruly visitors. But this was different. Moreau wasn't just being obnoxious, he was playing a dangerous game. "Sir, perhaps you should step back," Lundgren urged cautiously. "The guards are active-duty military." Moreau scoffed, yanking Brutus's leash again. "Oh yeah? And what's he gonna do? Stand there and look pretty?" His voice dripped with arrogance as he gestured toward Alexander Fischer, who remained perfectly still, his face a mask of disciplined indifference. Brutus let out a sharp bark, startling a group of schoolchildren huddled near their teacher. She instinctively moved to guide them away. But Moreau turned, flashing a wolfish grin. "Don't leave just yet, kids," he taunted. Brutus loves an audience. An elderly man, Colonel Bernard Dubois, stepped forward, his sharp eyes, hardened by years of military service, assessed the situation immediately. "That's enough," he said firmly. "This is a place of ceremony and respect." Moreau barked out a cruel laugh. "Respect? For what? A guy playing dress-up?" He deliberately let the leash slacken, allowing Brutus to edge even closer to Fischer's feet. The dog's nostrils flared, sensing both the tension in the air and the silent, immovable force in front of him. The colonel's jaw tightened. He had seen men like Moreau before, bullies who hid behind intimidation, who mistook discipline for weakness. "Son, that man is not just some ceremonial guard," Dubois warned. "He's a soldier." Moreau's eyes gleamed with amusement. "Then let's see how brave he really is." He loosened the leash further, and the bulldog surged forward another inch, his teeth bared. The air in the courtyard grew heavy, all sound drowned out by the steady, menacing growl of the animal. Still, Fischer did not move, but behind his trained stillness, his mind worked swiftly, analyzing the tension in Moreau's stance, the slight flicker of hesitation in Brutus's body language. This wasn't just some reckless tourist looking for trouble. This was an orchestrated act of intimidation. And it was about to escalate. The provocation begins. The courtyard of Schönbrunn Palace felt heavier now, as if the grand walls themselves were holding their breath. The murmurs of tourists had faded into uneasy silence, their eyes darting between the looming confrontation and the guard who remained as still as a statue. Vincent Moreau smirked, pleased with the attention. He thrived on it. His fingers played with Brutus's leash, letting it slacken just enough to allow the bulldog to inch closer to Alexander Fisher's gleaming black boots. Look at him, Moreau sneered, his voice carrying across the open space. All stiff and proper, acting like a damn statue. You think that uniform makes you special? A few feet away, Eric Lundgren, the tour guide, took a quiet step backward, subtly motioning for his group to follow. He'd seen too many situations like this, people who pushed boundaries, waiting for the moment they could provoke a reaction. Fisher, however, did not so much as flinch. His breathing remained steady, his gaze locked forward, trained for discipline. But beneath the surface, his mind was already assessing the real threat, not the dog, but its owner. Moreau chuckled, his fingers flexing around the leash. You know what I love about Brutus? He mused, his tone mocking. He's got a nose for weakness. And right now, he crouched slightly, whispering loud enough for the crowd to hear. He smells plenty of it. Brutus's growls deepened, but his body language told a different story, confusion. Despite his owner's aggression, there was something about Fisher's unshakable stillness that unsettled the dog. The animal's ears flicked back momentarily, sensing the contradiction between the hostility in Moreau's voice and the unwavering presence of the man before him. A small group of children, still huddled together, watched with wide eyes. Their teacher, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, gently nudged them toward the gates. But Moreau, sensing the shift, wasn't ready to let his audience slip away. Not so fast, he called out, his grin widening. Brutus loves an audience, don't you, boy? The bulldog's growl turned sharper as Moreau gave the leash a quick, deliberate jerk, forcing the animal closer. The sound of its claws scraping against the stones sent a fresh ripple of anxiety through the crowd. Colonel Bernard Dubois, the elderly veteran, stepped forward once more, his eyes, sharp with experience, took in the entire situation. He wasn't afraid, but he understood danger when he saw it. That's enough, Dubois said, his voice firm. This isn't a game, boy. Moreau's eyes darkened. Oh, I think it is, he hissed, and we're just getting started. His fingers twitched around the leash. The crowd instinctively braced. Fisher remained motionless, but inside, he knew this was about to escalate. And when it did, he would be ready. The air in Schonbrunn Palace's grand courtyard grew thick with tension, the weight of anticipation pressing down on the onlookers. No one spoke, no one dared to move too suddenly. Vincent Moreau was feeding off the moment, his ego swelling with each passing second of attention. He took another slow step forward, the polished stone beneath his boots scraping softly. Brutus, his powerful English bulldog, followed, his heavy body trembling with confused aggression. Moreau's fingers played lazily with the leash. What's wrong, soldier? He taunted, his smirk widening. Not so brave when you're facing something that can actually bite. Huh? Alexander Fisher remained impassive, his eyes fixed forward, his body perfectly motionless. To an untrained observer, he might have seemed indifferent. But beneath the surface, his mind was working at full speed. The leash, the dog's weight shifts, the pattern of Moreau's grip. Every detail mattered. Brutus, despite his growls, showed hesitation. Fisher caught the tell. Brief moments where the dog's ears flicked back. Uncertainty creeping in. The bulldog was not naturally violent, he was responding to his owner's manipulation. A tool in Moreau's sadistic game. From the crowd, a woman in a business suit slowly reached for her phone. Moreau's head snapped toward her. I wouldn't do that if I were you, he warned, his voice laced with quiet menace. Brutus doesn't like cameras. Brutus let out a bark, sharp and jarring. The woman hesitated, her fingers trembling over her screen before she slowly withdrew her hand. A young couple, who had been recording the palace moments before, quickly pocketed their phones, realizing that filming would only provoke Moreau further. See? Moreau turned back to Fisher, emboldened by the fear around him. Everyone loves to act brave until they realize that Brutus here plays for keeps. A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Colonel Bernard Dubois, the retired veteran, clenched his jaw. He'd seen men like Moreau before, men who hid their insecurities behind threats and intimidation. That's enough, Dubois said again, stepping closer. His voice, though aged, carried the unmistakable authority of experience. Moreau sneered. Or what, old man? You gonna lecture me about honor? Dubois didn't flinch. I don't need to, he replied, because you've already proven you have none. Moreau's smirk twitched. His fingers flexed around the leash. You hear that, Brutus? He mused. They think they can talk us down. He crouched slightly, the leash loosening ever so subtly. What do you say, boy? Should we show them what happens when someone underestimates us? The leash slackened just a little more. Brutus's body tensed, waiting. The courtyard felt like a battlefield before the first shot was fired. And Fisher, still unmoving, prepared for what he knew was coming next. The threat reaches its peak. The tension in Schönbrunn Palace's courtyard had reached a suffocating peak. Every tourist, every bystander, stood frozen in place, their eyes darting between the royal guard, the aggressive English bulldog, and the man holding its leash. Vincent Moreau was reveling in the fear. His lips curled into a slow, predatory smile as he let the leash slip a little more through his fingers. Brutus, though still growling, hesitated, his deep-set eyes flickering between his master and the unmoving Alexander Fisher. Moreau chuckled darkly. You see that? He sneered, addressing the crowd. Even a dog can tell when someone's faking it. Still, Fisher did not move. His ceremonial posture was unwavering, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his black bearskin hat. But inside, his instincts were razor-sharp, locked onto every micro-movement in Moreau's stance, every twitch of his fingers. This wasn't just bravado anymore. This was the prelude to an attack. The bulldog's powerful shoulders bunched, sensing the growing aggression in his master. Moreau's hand hovered near the leash's clasp, his breath shallow with excitement. From the crowd, Colonel Bernard Dubois stepped forward again. His voice was steady, calm, a soldier recognizing another soldier. Son, Dubois said, his gaze locked on Moreau. If you do this, you won't be walking away. Moreau scoffed, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his expression, uncertainty. Brutus, he whispered, low and deliberate, get ready. A palace security officer, previously blending into the crowd, had begun speaking into his radio. The movement caught Moreau's eye, and his smirk turned to a sneer. Calling for backup already? He taunted. What, afraid your toy soldier can't handle a little test? Fisher remained motionless. Moreau's fingers twitched around the clasp. The crowd tensed, bracing. Then, with a deliberate slowness, Moreau tilted his head toward Fisher, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. In about 5 seconds, you're gonna regret standing so still. His thumb pressed against the leash's release mechanism. Fisher's pulse slowed, his military training, his years of experience handling working dogs, all condensed into a single moment of absolute clarity. Moreau's lips curled into a final smirk. Time's up, soldier boy. Click. The leash snapped free. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd as Brutus lunged forward, his powerful body coiling into motion. Teeth bared, Moreau's face twisted into triumph. But Alexander Fisher had already moved, faster than anyone could process. The royal guard, previously a statue of ceremonial discipline, came to life. The battlefield had been set, and now, the real fight had begun. The guard's unexpected move. The Schönbrunn Palace courtyard erupted in gasps as Brutus lunged, his powerful frame coiling like a spring before launching forward. Teeth bared, muscles rippling. The attack was perfect, fast, aggressive, unavoidable, but Alexander Fisher had already anticipated it. In an instant, the stillness that had defined him shattered. With flawless precision, he dropped into a low stance, his white-gloved hands moving in a blur. Instead of dodging, instead of bracing for impact, he reached out. The crowd barely had time to process what was happening before Fisher's hands found their target, pressure points along Brutus's thick, muscular neck. Gasps turned into stunned silence as the seemingly unstoppable beast's momentum was redirected. 1 second, Brutus had been mid-lunge. The next, he was on the ground, completely subdued. His aggressive charge transformed into a controlled descent. The royal guard's hands moved with practiced authority, guiding the bulldog's weight, pressing into key nerve points that instantly diffused his attack instincts. The transformation was instantaneous. Where there had been pure aggression, now there was confusion. Where there had been resistance, now there was submission. Brutus's breathing slowed, his ears flicking back, his once tense body relaxed beneath Fisher's firm but careful grip. A single command, steady, calm, absolute, broke the stunned silence. "Easy there, soldier." Fisher's voice was not one of fear. It was of command. Brutus let out a low whine, his instincts battling between his master's past aggression and the true authority in the hands that held him now. Vincent Moreau's victory was gone. His smirk had twisted into pure disbelief. "Brutus, attack. What the hell are you doing?" he barked, his face reddening. But the bulldog barely spared him a glance. His tail twitched slightly, a sign of uncertainty, of something long buried beneath years of mistreatment resurfacing. Fisher continued his calm, controlled touch, fingers pressing into key muscle points that had been trained into working dogs for generations. "You've been trained properly before, haven't you?" Fisher murmured, barely above a whisper. "You remember what real command feels like." Brutus blinked, his deep-set eyes shifting from Moreau's desperation to Fisher's unwavering presence. A slow tail wag, a shift of weight. Then, before the eyes of the entire courtyard, Brutus rolled onto his back, exposing his belly in the ultimate sign of submission. The mighty beast had surrendered. The silence was deafening. Moreau's hands clenched into fists. His world, his control, was crumbling in real time. "No, no, that's my dog. You don't get to do that," he shouted. But it was no use. Brutus had made his choice. And Fisher, still calm, still precise, simply ran a gloved hand over the dog's head, reinforcing the lesson that had just been taught. True power wasn't in fear. It was in respect. Brutus's complete submission. A stunned silence engulfed the Schönbrunn Palace courtyard. No one moved, no one breathed. On the ground, Brutus, the once ferocious English bulldog, lay flat on his back, his powerful paws curled in the air in a show of total submission. His tail gave small, hesitant wags, his deep brown eyes fixed not on his owner, Vincent Moreau, but on the man who had just undone years of aggressive conditioning, Alexander Fisher. Moreau's face contorted in rage. "Brutus, get up. What the hell are you doing?" His voice cracked, shrill with disbelief. But the bulldog barely acknowledged him. Instead, he let out a low, contented huff as Fisher's white-gloved hand moved with careful precision, pressing lightly behind his ears in a way that made Brutus's entire body relax even further. The tension in the air shifted. Moreau had lost. "Unbelievable," a woman murmured from the crowd, breaking the hush. "Did you see that?" a man whispered. "He took down that dog like a trained handler." Fisher remained calm, his every movement deliberate. His voice was low, steady, commanding not through force, but through understanding. "You were never meant to be like this, were you?" he said softly, his fingers expertly working through Brutus's stiffened muscles. "This isn't what you were trained for." Brutus let out a slow exhale, his breathing easing. Moreau, however, was unraveling, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes darting wildly between his dog, his so-called weapon, and the royal guard who had effortlessly dismantled his control. You don't get to do this," he hissed. "That's my dog. You think you can just..." Fisher finally turned his gaze on him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't arrogance. It was authority. "This animal," Fisher said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "was never yours." Moreau froze. The royal guard turned his attention back to Brutus, his hands still moving with expert care. "Dogs like this," he continued, addressing the watching crowd, "come from generations of service animals, military lines, police lines. They are bred for intelligence, for discipline, for loyalty to real authority." His eyes flicked back to Moreau. "And you turned him into a tool for your own insecurities." Brutus, as if to punctuate Fisher's words, let out a satisfied sigh and nuzzled against the guard's boot, a stark contrast to the snarling beast he had been just minutes ago. Moreau took a shaky step backward. "Brutus, come here," he barked, desperation creeping into his voice. The bulldog didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look at him. Instead, he wagged his tail, fully, freely, for the first time. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. This wasn't just a well-trained dog recognizing a skilled handler. This was a creature choosing who he truly belonged to. And it wasn't Vincent Moreau. Fisher explains proper dog training. The courtyard of Schönbrunn Palace was no longer filled with fear, it was filled with astonishment. The once aggressive Brutus sat calmly at Alexander Fisher's feet, his tail wagging steadily, his powerful frame completely relaxed. The contrast was staggering. The same dog that had been snarling and lunging just moments ago was now obedient and at ease, responding to real authority instead of intimidation. Vincent Moreau, still standing a few feet away, looked as if the world had tilted off its axis. His face burned red with frustration. His fists clenched and unclenched, as if searching for some kind of control he no longer had. Fisher, however, was completely composed. His posture was flawless, his expression unreadable beneath his ceremonial uniform. But his next words, steady and full of purpose, were not for Moreau alone, they were for the entire crowd. "You see," Fisher began, his voice clear and even, "a dog like this isn't just muscle and aggression. He's the product of generations of careful breeding, for intelligence, for obedience, for loyalty." Brutus tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching at the calm, commanding tone. "These dogs," Fisher continued, his white-gloved hands gesturing to Brutus with deliberate precision, "are meant to work alongside their handlers. They are trained to protect, to serve, not to be turned into weapons of intimidation by those who misunderstand their purpose." The crowd was silent, hanging onto his every word. Fisher crouched slightly, his movements smooth and controlled. He ran his fingers lightly along Brutus's shoulders, demonstrating pressure points, the same ones he had used moments ago to defuse the attack. Dogs like Brutus are trained to respond to confidence, discipline, and respect, he explained, not to fear. He pressed gently against a point near Brutus's neck, and the bulldog instinctively relaxed further, his eyes softening. Moreau scoffed, though his voice lacked the arrogance it had before. "Yeah? Well, he was doing just fine before you got involved." Fisher's gaze finally snapped toward him, sharp as a blade. "No," he said simply. "He wasn't." Moreau flinched. Fisher straightened. "What you did," he continued, his voice taking on an edge of quiet authority, "wasn't training. It was corruption. You took an animal with the potential to be a protector, a service dog, even a search and rescue companion, and you turned him into a tool for your own insecurities." Brutus let out a soft huff, as if agreeing. Moreau's mouth opened, then closed. He had nothing to say. Fisher turned back to the crowd, his hands moving through another series of signals, ones Brutus followed effortlessly. "This isn't just about one dog," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "It's about understanding responsibility. When we take an animal under our care, we don't just own them, we lead them. And real leadership doesn't come from fear." He gave Brutus one final pat. "It comes from respect." Moreau's downfall. The weight of Alexander Fisher's words settled over the courtyard like an undeniable truth. The crowd, once paralyzed by fear, now watched in quiet judgment, not of the dog, but of the man who had wielded him as a weapon. Brutus, the once menacing English bulldog, sat obediently at Fisher's feet, his tail wagging lazily, his body relaxed but alert. The transformation was complete, from a tool of intimidation to a disciplined, intelligent creature who had simply needed the right leadership. Vincent Moreau, however, was unraveling. This is bullshit," he spat, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. His eyes darted between Brutus, the royal guard, and the now approaching police officers. Inspector Matteo Rossi, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an air of quiet authority, strode forward, flanked by two officers. He took in the scene with practiced efficiency, the guard standing unshaken. The subdued dog, the nervous crowd, and Moreau's fists clenched in frustration. "We've received multiple reports of intentional animal abuse and public endangerment," Rossi said coolly, flipping open his notepad. "And from what I see here, those reports were more than accurate." Moreau's nostrils flared. "This is my dog. You can't just take him from me." Before Rossi could respond, Dr. Ingrid Hoffman, a veteran animal welfare officer, stepped forward, kneeling beside Brutus with a trained eye. She barely needed to examine him. His response to Fisher alone told her everything she needed to know. "This dog," she said, running a gentle hand along his muscular frame, "comes from a working bloodline. Trained properly, he could serve in security, search and rescue, or therapy." She straightened, her gaze icy as it landed on Moreau. "Instead, you turned him into a weapon." Moreau scoffed, but his voice cracked under the pressure. "He's just a dog." Fisher's voice cut through like steel. "No, he's a soldier." The words hit harder than any punch. The crowd murmured in agreement, their disgust for Moreau palpable. Rossi closed his notepad with a decisive snap. "You're under arrest for reckless endangerment, animal cruelty, and inciting an attack in a public space." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Moreau stiffened, his bravado evaporating. "Wait." The officers moved swiftly, grabbing his arms, snapping the handcuffs into place. "You can't do this," he howled, his voice cracking into desperation. "Brutus, come here. Boy, come on." Brutus finally turned toward him. But he didn't move, he simply blinked, as if seeing Moreau clearly for the first time, and choosing not to follow. Moreau's entire world crumbled, as the officers led him away. The same crowd he had tried to intimidate now watched in silent condemnation. Meanwhile, Brutus remained by Fisher's side, his loyalty now earned by respect, not fear. The lesson learned, as Vincent Moreau was escorted away in handcuffs. The tension in the Schönbrunn Palace courtyard finally began to dissipate. The very crowd that had once stood frozen in fear now murmured amongst themselves, not in relief, but in understanding. This had not just been an incident. It had been a lesson. At the center of it all, Brutus, the once intimidating English bulldog, remained calm at Alexander Fisher's feet. His transformation was more than just obedience, it was trust, earned through understanding and true leadership. Inspector Matteo Rossi exchanged a glance with Dr. Ingrid Hoffman, the animal welfare officer. She knelt beside Brutus, assessing his demeanor with the practiced eye of someone who had seen far too many cases of mistreated animals. "He'll be fine," she murmured, her voice laced with quiet approval. "It's clear he's responding to proper handling." She turned to Fisher, nodding in respect. "What you did just now, that wasn't just discipline. That was restoration." Fisher gave Brutus a firm but gentle pat. "Dogs like him," he said evenly, "aren't born dangerous. They're made dangerous by the people who lead them." The crowd listened, absorbing his words. A young father, who had earlier pulled his son away from the scene, now knelt beside his child. "You see?" he whispered. "Real strength isn't about scaring people. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Nearby, Colonel Bernard Dubois, the elderly veteran, folded his arms, nodding approvingly. "Took a real soldier to see the truth," he murmured. The real danger today hadn't been Brutus, it had been Moreau. It was a lesson in power, in how it can be wielded for destruction or for protection. Moreau had used fear, hoping to manipulate and control. Fisher had used respect, knowledge, and discipline, proving that true authority does not come from brute force, it comes from understanding. One woman, still clutching her phone, finally spoke. "I was going to call for help, but I think we all needed to see this." Another man nodded. "We always assume those guards just stand there. But now, I wonder what else they're trained for." Fisher, standing tall once more, returned to his position, his posture impeccable, his uniform still immaculate. But for the first time, the crowd saw him differently. He wasn't just a ceremonial figure. He was a soldier, a protector, a leader. And as Brutus was carefully led away by Dr. Hoffman, his tail wagging ever so slightly, it was clear that leadership, true leadership, had changed his life forever. The lesson of the day wasn't just about a dog or a guard. It was about how power is used, and who truly deserves to wield it.